Worship leaders, worship musicians, and those who love to worship. Today we're going to be talking about lifeless worship. If you are a worship leader, that phrase probably scares you to death. You can't imagine looking out on a Sunday morning and seeing lifeless worship in your congregation. But there are actually two kinds of lifeless worship, and one is harder to diagnose. Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Worship Homestead. My name is Nathan Smith. Thank you for joining me. Today we're talking about lifeless worship and how you can avoid that. We want life-filled worship. But what does that look like? Well, before we get there, I want to give you something. If you go to my website, blueprintsounds.com, you can get access to my free worship training bundle called the Worship Booster Pack. It has PDF guides and online classes on everything from worship songwriting, how to build a better band, how to arrange your band, cheat codes for church sound. All of that is available on my website, or you can click on the link nearby, blueprintsounds.com/worship booster pack. All right, let's talk about lifeless worship. So if you're a worship leader, you've probably experienced this. You know, when you're leading worship from your guitar, your piano, you're singing, and you're looking out into the audience and you're seeing nothing, right? It's blah. You're not getting anything from those people, and it's kind of demoralizing because you're like, we spent all this time, we're practicing, we're coming together to worship God corporately, and there's not much in the way of outward expression. What's going on there? Well, nobody really wants to be part of a worship set like that. And often you'll hear people talk about engagement, right? How can you increase engagement in your church? And what we're talking about is how can you get hands lifted, people clapping, smiles, moving in the aisles, whatever it is, whatever you're gauging, what's, good for your church. People are wanting, how do we get more engagement out of our audience? So a lifeless audience, from outward signs would be ones that's, slack-jawed, hands down at the side, not really participating, not really singing. That's one thing. There's not much joy in that type of worship. But there's another kind of lifeless worship that is just as bad, but it looks good. We're going to get there in a second, but first I'd like to go to the Old Testament. We're in Genesis chapter 28, and we're looking at Jacob's ladder, and we're explaining one of God's principles that he put in nature that he also put in the spiritual realm, and that is giving and receiving. We're in Genesis 28, verse 10. Then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went toward Haran. He came to a certain place and spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place and put it under his head and lay down in that place. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord God stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac, the land on which you lie. I will give it to you and to your descendants. The interesting thing about this passage is that when Jacob sees the ladder and he sees the angels ascending and descending, there is a cycle, there is a flow happening at that spot, at Bethel, which used to be called Luz, and then he renames it Bethel. Angels are going up the ladder, angels are coming down the ladder. That fits with the way that God has created everything in nature to work. If you think about your own body, you inhale, you intake, and you exhale. You receive, and you give out. If we think about the day and the night, right? First comes night, then comes day. In Jewish understanding, that's because we receive first at night, and we give out during the day. Or a great example of this is the water cycle, right? Clouds have precipitation. When it gets to be too much, it falls down to the ground and it waters the earth and it fills up the rivers and streams. But then evaporation happens and the water goes back up into the clouds so that it can start over again. This cycle is perfectly balanced. From creation, there has never been any new matter. Right? We can split things apart and put them back together, but there's nothing new from the time of creation until now. This cycle balances itself out. Water, our own bodies, everything in nature has giving and receiving built into it. That's also true in the spiritual realm. We saw that with the story of Jacob's ladder, the angels ascending and descending, going up to heaven, coming down from heaven, going to earth. But it also happens in the book of Revelation. Here I am in Revelation 8, verse 3. Another angel came and stood at the altar, holding a golden censer, and much incense was given to him, so that he might add it to the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar, which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints went up before God out of the angel's hand. Then the angel took the censer and filled it with the fire of the altar and threw it to the earth. And there followed peals of thunder and sounds and flashes of lightning and an earthquake. So what we see in Revelation are the prayers of the saints mixed with incense rising up to God. And then we see the angel filling his censer with that and then casting it down to the earth. It's going up, it's going down. Very interesting. The point is that worship is a cycle. As we worship, as our incense of our prayers and our thanksgivings, as they rise up to bless the Lord, it says that it rises up like an incense that fills his nostrils. Our worship completes a cycle of blessing, of giving and receiving with the Lord, and here's how it works. You've often heard that worship is a response to God's goodness. Absolutely true. God is always giving first. But our thanksgiving and our praise in response to what he's already given us completes that cycle. So God gives good gifts, obviously. But when we thank him, our prayers and our thanksgiving rise like incense into his nostrils. And that completes the cycle. We're receiving and we're also giving. Well, here's the problem with lifeless worship. Lifeless worship is when you cut off one of the cycles. It doesn't matter which one. On the one hand, if you stop receiving, if you only consider worship a duty, right? It's like, no, God, it doesn't matter what I'm feeling. I'm going to praise you no matter what because you're worthy. Okay, that's true. Yes. However, if we only view worship as something that we give to God and we downplay or we cut off what we're receiving from him, it cuts off the cycle. Right? Just like the water cycle, precipitation, evaporation. If you cut off one of those parts of the cycle, you don't get a full cycle. And that's where the joyless drudgery comes from in worship. When you see worship that, boy, why is it so lackluster? Why aren't we seeing the outward signs that we see defined in the Bible as this is what praise looks like? It's because we've cut off receiving. It's because we haven't understood what thanksgiving is. Which means we haven't really received from the Lord, or we haven't seen the resources that he's giving us. That's on one side of things. But there's the other side, and this I think is more dangerous for the evangelical church right now because this is where I see us, is that we have only been receiving and forgot the other half of it. So if you had a lot of worship songs that constantly talked about what we're receiving from God. I'm going to see my victory. The Lord fights my battle. My breakthrough is on its way. All that type of stuff. Those songs are not bad because obviously we need to be receiving from the Lord and acknowledging it. That's part of the cycle. But if you only ever receive in your worship and you never bless the Lord, if you never complete the cycle, there's no output, you also cut off the cycle of life. Think of the Dead Sea in Israel. The Dead Sea is super salty, nothing can grow in there. Why? Not because there's no input, it has things running into it, there's nothing coming out of it. It doesn't go anywhere. That water is stagnant and stays there. In the body, we would call that a cancer cell. A cancer cell takes and takes and takes and takes and never produces anything good for the body. It just simply grows and is. And that's malignant. The same is true in our worship. We can have worship that looks vibrant, that the synths flow over the top of us. We feel so good when we come to worship. It's sort of like a product. We treat it like a spa day. Oh, doesn't this feel so nice that I'm worshiping? We even do that when we're church shopping. Say that, you move to a new city and you're looking for a new church to attend. You're probably going to look at childcare if you're a parent and what the facilities are like. Do you like the pastor? Do you like his sermons? One of the things that you're looking at, I guarantee you, is what's the worship like? And when we say that, there's this hidden assumption in the back of our heads that the worship is for us. We're receiving something. Oh, I like how it sounds because it suits my tastes. Well, the problem is, if you're only receiving, it's like cancer. It's like the Dead Sea. There's no output. There has to be the other half of the cycle where we bless the Lord. That, unfortunately, is where I see the evangelical church right now. We've gone really heavy on receiving, but here's the problem with that. If we go heavy on receiving and we cut off that flow of blessing the Lord for what he's done for us, the way that you know that that's happened is that the focus will start to slightly shift and it will become more and more inward. It will become more and more about the self. So you'll start to see that in the songs, and you'll start to see that even in the way that the songs are produced, that they become very, very comfortable, and the blessing the Lord part goes away or gets downplayed, so that there's a very little bit of blessing God and there's a very lot of bit of receiving. That's how you know that things have gotten out of balance. So as a worship leader, you probably don't want that. You probably want a healthy balance of giving and receiving. How do you go about making sure that you have a healthy cycle? Well, it's not simply a matter of, well, I need to have blessing songs and receiving songs, and let's have a metric so that if I've got 4 songs, I've got 2 of each. If you do that, I guarantee that it will sound contrived and forced, and it will just be a formula, and that's not what we want. Instead, here's what I suggest. Go to the Bible and start looking up stories of people being blessed, of receiving from the Lord. Then go to the Bible and look up stories of people blessing the Lord. And if you're in the American church, I would think that you probably want to skew more into the blessing, just because we've had so much theology, so many songs written lately in the ether about receiving. We're pretty full up on that right now. So maybe just for a little bit, skew heavier on the blessing. Well, Jacob is a great example of that. Let's read a little bit more of that passage about Jacob's ladder. So after the Lord blesses Jacob and says, I'm going to give you this land, you're going to be like the dust of the earth, you and your seed. So Jacob wakes up. He says in verse 16, Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, How awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on its top. He called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, If God will be with me and will keep me on this journey that I take, and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, then I will return to my father's house in safety. Then the Lord will be my God. This stone, which I have set up as a pillar, will be God's house, and all that you give me I will surely give 1/10 to you. Jacob sets up the stone as a pillar. He makes an altar to the Lord. He pours out an oil sacrifice, and he says, God, whatever you give me, I will give 1/10 back to you. So Jacob, in that one story, is completing the cycle. He's being blessed abundantly, and yet he's also blessing God. And everything that Jacob said he would do, he did. He eventually moved back to Bethel and lived there. And throughout Jacob's life, you see him blessing a lot of people. At the end of his life, he blesses his 12 sons. He's blessing everybody all the time because he understood that the cycle has to be completed. We have to receive, but we also have to give. So keep your eyes open for, yes, people receiving good blessings from God. Absolutely true. And also, keep your eyes open for people blessing the Lord or blessing others, because that's how the cycle gets completed, and that's how life happens. When you take one of the two of those away, you end up with lifeless worship. Even if it looks good, it doesn't actually produce anything. And what I want for you is that your worship would be full of life. Hey, I hope that video helps you. And again, if you need help with your worship team, go to my website, blueprintsounds.com/worship booster pack. Until next week, God bless and goodbye.